My Lords, the 7th of October Hamas attack on Israel was more than a war crime. This anti-Jewish pogrom was dripping with sadism. Do you remember the horror when we saw films some years ago of so-called Jihadi John and the ISIS Beatles using swords to behead hostages such as David Haynes and James Foley? The cruelty of it. We knew then that this was not about the number of hostages killed, a handful that we know of in that instance, but we viscerally understood that this was an off-the-scale incident in terms of depravity. Well, those sickening shockwaves 1,000 times over in response to October the 7th's killing spree, at which Hamas butchers recorded themselves boasting of their torture and violence and gloating over the desecration of naked dead bodies. And yet, ever since then, self-styled progressives in the UK, Europe and the US have insisted the evil of the atrocity emanates from Israel, presenting the real victims as civilians in Gaza. In a grotesque distortion of political categories, events on October the 7th are being portrayed as some sort of justifiable resistance to oppression. Too many, especially shamefully on the left, seem to be stuck in the past, imagining today's Palestinian armed resistance is the same as earlier national liberation movements fighting against colonialism. Indeed, Green Party MSP Maggie Chapman responded to the Hamas attack by posting, quote, "The oppressed are fighting back. Don't let the Western media fool you into thinking it's terrorism. This is decolonisation." Well, let me be clear. No, it isn't. As someone who has supported Palestinian rights for decades, I find it disgusting to suggest that Hamas is any kind of a national liberation movement trying to free Palestine. In reality, it's an anti-Semitic death cult hell-bent on establishing a global Islamic caliphate. And how do I know that? Read the Hamas constitution, watch its propaganda. There is not an iota of aspiration to democratic or freedoms for the Palestinians or for anyone else in its tracks. And yet still, in the media and on mass demonstrations and in all online platforms, swathes of right-minded people are queuing up to point the finger at Israel for bringing on the massacre on itself, and an embarrassed silence about Hamas's crimes. It's hard to explain such moral disorientation. As one commentator notes, those who collaborated with the Nazis often claimed they didn't know Hitler's henchmen were planning to exterminate the Jewish people. Today's progressive apologists in the West have no such excuse, as Islamists flaunt their desire to eliminate the Jews, and yet still too many look away, ignoring these inconvenient truths. Such attitudes present our society with a problem. Beyond the military battles in the Middle East, we have a domestic battle of ideas to fight and some difficult questions to answer. Let's ask the thousands of British and European artists who issued an open letter accusing Israel no less, of unprecedented cruelty, quote, for its dealings with Gaza. Let's ask them why they didn't write a similar open letter on the unprecedented cruelty of the Hamas pogrom, although sadly it wasn't unprecedented for the Jews. We have to ask those who angrily demonstrated against the accused Israeli perpetrator of the horrific bombing of the hospital in Gaza, if now all the evidence suggests a misfired Islamic jihad missile, why weren't these progressive humanitarians, as we speak, out on the streets expressing righteous fury against these Palestinian civilian killers? We also have to ask, how do we explain that we now have open support for radical Islam on UK city streets? Why have we allowed it to grow unchecked for years? Concerns quashed as Islamophobia. We have to ask as well why so many students and young people see all Jews as part of a privileged oppressor class. Why we've allowed the toxic influence of identity politics and its discourse of white privilege, of which Jews are collectively seen as the epitome, grow unchallenged. Why have so many institutions such as university buckled in the face of this identitarian ideology of competitive victimhood, which gives anyone claiming the label of oppressed victimhood a collective pass. And we have to ask why diversity advocates, who are usually hypersensitive to alleged racist microaggressions, such as using phrases like blacklisting, suddenly become deaf and dumb while marching alongside groups of radicalised youth shouting Allah Akbar and anti-Semitic dog whistles. And now, finally, we as legislators have to ask how we should respond at this pivotal moment, now that the curtain has been pulled back on this new anti-Semitism. One plea that I have to us all today is that we should resist the siren calls for more hate speech laws, for people to be sacked for wrongthing, for arrests to be made of those using offensive, dangerous slogans, however repugnant or hateful. Unlike Lord Stevens of Birmingham, whose excellent speech I agreed with, apart from on this question, I don't think we need more laws to solve these problems. Even in the few years that I've been in this place, we've passed a plethora of draconian public order and speech-restricting laws. But I fear that a public clamour for more restrictions is likely in response to what at best could be described as eccentric policing priorities, so well described by Baroness Eaton. The police can turn up at your door if you misgender someone. They can arrest you for praying silently in the wrong place. They can treat a terrified autistic pupil as a criminal for accidentally kicking a Quran. Yet the police stand by passively as pro-Gaza protesters deface public monuments, scale scaffolding of government buildings and allow people to run riot on the streets. But despite such institutional torpor, eroding free speech is never the answer. We need to face the pernicious cultural problems I've discussed face on. And if we're to take Baroness Deitch's call for more and better education seriously, if we're to win young hearts and minds away from the new identitarian anti-Semitism, and to offer the young some moral clarity, we need more, not less, difficult arguments in the public sphere. Indeed, we have illustrated the importance of such public debate here today, and it's a credit to the noble lords who've spoken that that has happened. I hope that we can move forward without compromising our commitment to freedom.
My Lords, it is no easy matter